All right, thank you for coming. Welcome, everybody. Hope everyone had a Merry Christmas, and New Year's is almost upon us here, going into 2025 here, spectacular pace. So, as you know, NVAR came out with some changes to the forms, go into effect on January 1st. Nothing earth-shattering, some nice little changes here, little things that they did to the contract, but nothing like they have done previously this year. So we'll go over those, and feel free to ask questions as we go. Make sure you have a microphone in your hand so that, because we are recording it, so the people who are watching this after the fact can hear what your question was, because they may have the same question. All right, so starting off here, the first change that they made, and I'm going numerically as per the printout in your takeaway package. The first one is the exclusive right to sell listing agreement, exclusive agency listing agreement, and exclusive right to sell for unimproved land. So they made the same changes to all three of these documents. The first one is they broadened the option for broker compensation. So they keep messing with that broker compensation paragraph, right? They're making it as difficult or as easy for us as possible, whichever way you want to look at it. So I highlighted that. That's paragraph 6 of your exclusive right to sell listing agreement. So in this paragraph, what they did, I think it used to be 2 fields before. Now it's 3 fields. They added an additional field in there. And now it says listing broker compensation for the seller will pay broker compensation, so you can do a percentage of the sale price. You can do a actual flat fee number, so whatever that number might be, or you can do a combination thereof. So if you wanted to do a 1% or whatever percent you wanted to put in there, plus if you have a team fee or a transaction coordinator fee or whatever fee you might have in there, you could add it into that blank right there as an additional fee for your listing. So they made that change. They removed the variable rate compensation. So under the new way of doing business, there's really no variable rate, right? Because we're doing listing side. This is our listing side commission. It's not total commission anymore. It's not I'm still seeing brokerage agreements coming in with a very large listing brokerage compensations, which I know folks are still mentally at the total compensation, but it's not total compensation anymore. This is how much you're charging to list the property. The buyer side is a total separate paragraph and additional addendum now, right? So that was a change. They removed that. And then they said you do not need to update your active listing agreements due to this change. So if you have active listings going on currently, just because they're updating this form, you don't have to make any swap out of this form compared to the other one. Unlike the change back in July and August, if you had a previous edition, they were recommending that you update to the new forms. Any questions on that change? Right, pretty cut and dry, right? The next one was the exclusive right to lease, the exclusive right to lease agreement. So, or did I skip one? No, I skipped one, sorry. Exclusive right to represent buyers agreement. So in this one, they also broadened the options for broker compensation as well. So they added the third block as well for here, where you can have your percentage, you can have a dollar amount, or you can have a combination of the two. So you really, in here, you're supposed to be putting down what you're going to charge your buyer, right? So yes, we're going to try and get compensation from the seller through the contract, but you really should be listing what your actual cost, what that cost is going to be to that buyer. Why, right? Even though this isn't a change, I added it in here just because there seems to be a lot of confusion regarding it. If you stick in paragraph 8 and get down to paragraph 8E, it talks about retention of excess compensation. The buyer's agreement exclusively says that if the broker may not receive any compensation, including fees, which exceed the amount set forth in this agreement. So I've been sending emails out to folks who have been putting 0 in their brokerage agreements, right? And asking them if they plan to get a commission on this deal, because according to paragraph 8E, it says that any amount that you might have put into your sales contract as seller paid buyer agent compensation, theoretically, by this brokerage agreement, you're not entitled to if you put 0 in your brokerage agreement. So be cognizant of the fact that that statement is in there, right? Not you guys out here, but you guys watching from home. But because we are all on page here, right? Right? We're all doing that already. Well, believe it or not, I added this in over the weekend when I was home, and it's not part of this. It's not part of this because it's not a change, but I only bring it up because I want to say I wrote like 4 emails over the weekend of people who sent me brokerage agreements that had 0 in the compensation. So I said, well, while I'm doing this class, I'm going to bring this point out. So yeah, there's not a page for this. Sorry about that. So, you know me, I got the opportunity to get you guys all in a room, so I figured I would hit you with it, right? Any questions on that? We got one here and one in the back. Well, the brokerage fee would still be in the brokerage service fee.
Okay, that's my question.
So the $395 would still go in the
395,
brokerage
okay.
service fee paragraph, which is paragraph 8C.
Right, okay.
You don't have to add it, but some people still do. But like most of the time, you'll see additional amounts with folks that are doing teams or have they'll charge an extra fee for transaction coordination. Yes. So you'll see like say 3% plus $695 or 3% plus whatever whatever they might have for a team fee.
And then one other thing on the $395 brokerage fee, we always like to remind folks to please use the Sampson Properties form. There's a separate in-house form for that. Most of you should know. Brokerage service fee explained. Technically, it's not required if you have it. It's good to have it in the brokerage agreement, but having the additional document, it really explains it a little bit better. All right? Thank you.
Yes, sir.
Is there any room here for a contingency? For example, our fee will be 1% or whatever the lister or the seller offers?
I hate this topic, but you could put verbiage in paragraph 19, which is the additional provisions paragraph, saying, whatever your compensation is. But I have kind of an anecdote every time someone asks me that question. And I say, if you call a plumber and the plumber says my fee is $500 to do this service for you, but if you only got $250, I'll take it. Which price do you think you would pay as a consumer, right? You're going to want to pay the lower price. So if you advertise in your brokerage agreement that you're charging 2.5% or 3%, and then in the other provisions you write, I'm willing to take as little as 1%. Well, why as the buyer?
What if you say you're willing to take more? They got negotiated.
So you write 1% in the paragraph 8A, and then in the provisions you write more?
Or any higher amount negotiated by
Up to a certain amount, you could.
I know we've talked about it before, and and I see agreements all the time. People do them. They'll put either a 3% in this paragraph 8A, and then in the other provisions they'll write, that they're going to work to get the seller to pay the 3 or 2.5%. But if they can't negotiate a seller paid buyer agent compensation, the minimum commission owed is whatever. And so I sign them, I see them, but I always say if you're selling your worth, I'm sitting down with you and I'm saying I'm worth I'm going to say 2%. I'm worth 2% of the sale price. And then when we're filling out the contract, I put 3% in there. Well, what happens if your buyer loses that contract, right? Because you put 3% in there and you lost maybe by a dollar amount, right? Because you had a higher number in there, right? Well, now you're kind of feeling bad a little bit. Well, did I just cost my buyer? Okay, I tried to get 3%. My buyer agency agreement says 2, or 3, but I'm willing to take 2. Should I have put 2 in there? I mean, it kind of puts us in a bad situation, right, with our client if we're asking for more money than we're actually telling them that we're worth, right? So if we sit down with them and we say, hey, this is how come I'm worth this amount right here. If you get to a situation where you put that amount in the contract and they counter you, now you can make a decision whether or not you're willing to take a lower amount, right? You as the buyer agent as Sampson. But sometimes you may not have that opportunity if they just say, okay, you put 3% in here. We took an offer that had 2. Well, my agreement only really had 1.5, right? But I tried to get a higher number because in the other provisions it said that I was going to try and get a higher number. So am I worth 3 or am I worth 1.5? What is my value? That's what we all really should be figuring out as we go through this cycle, right? That way when we're sitting down with buyers and we tell them how much they owe us, right? Hey, we're going to try and get paid by the seller. Here's how much you owe us. This is why my value, I've got 23 years of experience. You know, I've written X amount of contracts. I know what's going on in the market. I'm going to do this, I'm going to do that. You go through the plethora of all the things that you're going to provide to that buyer client or seller client, and that's how you come up with that number. Hold on a second.
There's an old Quaker proverb that says, nothing is sure but thee and me, and I have my doubts about thee. Might it be good practice for us to put our highest and best in paragraph A and then explain in paragraph 19 the dynamics of the new law that says, okay, you're not going to, if the seller offers less, we take less.
I would that's the way most of them are coming in, but I would recommend if you do that, put a cap of that number. So what if they come back at 0?
Minimum, you mean?
Yeah, a minimum. So whatever your minimum is, that's 1%, 1.5%, whatever that minimum is, make sure that you denote it. Otherwise, if you leave it as you're willing to take whatever the seller is willing to pay, if they counter at 0, now you have to have a serious talk with your buyer. Now your buyer is going to look at you like you're going to cause me to not get the home of my dreams, right? So, Cece?
I just want to clarify. If I say 3% for buyer compensation, if we went to new home builder, they advertise, they say, we're willing to give you 2% plus bonus. If that bonus is within the 3% of your commission, you can take it then.
That'd be correct.
Okay, that's it.
Yes, ma'am.
Hi, sorry, just a quick thing. I think I saw an email from Sarah a couple of months ago, and she wrote it in a way where it really made sense. I think the provision was something like broker agrees to reduce or to accept the commission that is essentially given by the seller and reduced it to whatever the seller is willing. But that's like a one-sentence phrase, and I've been using that, and I think,
She might have put that on. Did she put that on the Sampson group?
It was an email. It was in quotation, so I just basically used the same quotation.
I mean, I would be careful about leaving that, when you're writing that down, leaving that open-ended to whatever the seller is going to pay.
Of course.
Because if you put in there that, you could theoretically be subjecting yourself to 0. Because if you look at those stats coming out from Cardinal, there are some transactions that are going through without a buyer agent compensation, seller paid buyer agent compensation. So there is a possibility of that. So make sure that you protect yourself.
Absolutely, thank you.
So. All right, moving on to exclusive right to lease. So this is the updated exclusive right to lease. They also broadened the broker compensation field. So here they did the same thing. They added the additional field. They have the percentage, the dollar amount, and then the other, so you can do a combination of. They also removed the variable rate compensation option, so there's no longer an option for that in this agreement. They also clarified that tenants' brokerage compensation, if any, is optional. So if you see the highlighted highlighted point here under paragraph B, but before I do, I did highlight a higher up there as well where they added language in. I don't know, is it in here or not? But they added language in that says the landlord authorizes broker to collect the first full month's rent from the tenant and to credit it towards the landlord's obligation to pay brokerage compensation. So that has been added in as well, which it wasn't in there, and sometimes there was confusion in regards to, hey, the brokerage took the first month's rent, blah, blah, blah. You know, so now there's language in here actually that authorizes that from the landlord.
So not to get us too off track, so you can table it if you need to, but can you take this opportunity to do a quick review of Sampson's policies on dual agency on rental listings or not doing dual agency, and then what do we have to do if we have an unrepresented applicant to the property?
Sure. Sampson's policy on dual agency on rental transactions is that they prohibit it. So, but that doesn't mean you cannot rent your own listings to an unrepresented tenant. So if a tenant calls you from Zillow or whatever, leads, and they're unrepresented, you can show the property under your listing agreement to an unrepresented tenant as long as you disclose to them that you're representing the landlord. If they choose to be unrepresented, you could do all the paperwork, treat them as a customer, unrepresented. They would sign the disclosure for unrepresented parties, and then everybody would move forward in the transaction. There would be no tenant rep. Some folks I know they don't want to deal with it at all, so they'll have someone that they work with, that any lead that comes in for them, they send it over to another agent that they're working with to show the property and all that kind of stuff. I always say to them, under those circumstances, you're initially a representative of the seller, but you can have a conversation with that tenant that if they're looking for tenant representation, you could represent them as well, and that way it would be designated representation. So you can kind of do it whatever way you want. You just can't do both sides yourself.
Add, for those that might be curious, the reason why it's different with rentals, and we have this prohibition against dual agency on rentals where we don't have a hard and fast prohibition with sales is because with a sale, and this is Virginia we're talking about, because dual agency is not legal in other states at the agent level. But with sales, at least if you do dual agency, the seller gets the house, the seller gets the money, buyer gets the house, the seller goes on, everything's usually happy, hunky-dory. But with a rental, if you do dual agency, obviously we have two clients at the agent level and at the brokerage level. And you got one client living in another client's home for an extended period of time, the term of the lease. And I don't know if you all have experienced it, but Steve and I experience landlord-tenant dispute issues all the time. And so it can be a can of worms having one client live in another client's house all that time, and we can't go to bat for either client if we wanted to. If we were so inclined, we can't under dual agency. So that's really the fundamental reason for that.
Did that answer your question? Okay, so they clarified. Let's make sure I'm in the right spot. They clarified the tenant's broker compensation, if any, is optional. So here in paragraph 6B, they have written in that tenant brokerage compensation, and they bolted and underlined optional, and is an amount taken from the brokerage compensation and paid to any brokers representing the tenant in the transaction. So this is pretty much the same total compensation theory. On paragraph A, you're telling how much that you're charging for total compensation and how much of that amount we are going to share with the tenant rep if there is one. And then, of course, this landlord has the right to know that it's an optional amount. right? And then we would fill in that amount there with whatever percentage or flat fee or other scenario that we write in there, and that would go in paragraph 6B. The next one is authorizes broker to collect first full month's rent and credit that towards broker compensation and any compensation to a tenant broker. I talked about that. That's in paragraph 6A now, the last sentence. And practice tips, you do not need to update your active agreements due to this change, right? So paragraph C also has the additional listing broker compensation for unrepresented buyers. They added that in there. So same as the listing agreement for exclusive right to sell. If a tenant comes in and they're not represented, are you going to charge that landlord an additional fee for an unrepresented tenant, right? So whether or not you're going to do that or not, because a lot of times, right, a tenant comes forward who doesn't have representation, we do the deal, and the landlord wants that percentage paid back to them, right? Well, there was no tenant agent. Why am I paying you an additional X amount of percentage, right? So now, if they're unrepresented, you can fill in that field for whatever you're charging for having that scenario.
Steve, important to remind people, I think, so there is a very real difference there between this one and the exclusive right to sell, in that this one has the total, of which the tenant broker compensation, if applicable, is part of the total. But again, with the exclusive right to sell, it's not the total. It's listing side only, and then any additional for unrepresented. That may be explicitly clear, but I wanted to point it out again, because in this one, you better put, if you want a full month's rent or whatever your total is, if there's an unrepresented tenant and you handle it yourself, you want to make sure that you've got the correct amount that you're expecting for the total.
Thanks, sir.
Here you go.
Is there a suggested amount for the unrepresented tenant or typical amount?
I couldn't tell you because this is the first time it's been on the form, but I haven't seen one. I would say it depends on what your practice is, right? If your practice is that you normally give that say you're paying out 25% to the tenant rep, and your practice is that you normally give that back to the landlord. Well, now you may not want to do that. You could add that back in and make sure that the landlord's perfectly clear that says that 25%, even though it's in the total commission, is paid whether or not that there is a tenant rep or a unrepresented party, right?
So this really is we're being authorized a specific amount to publish, to promote, market as tenant broker compensation, right, Steve?
Right.
Even though it doesn't go in MLS.
Correct.
But it's still part of the total.
Yeah. All right, next on the docket, exclusive right to represent tenant. They include a ratification of lease to term end date to this agreement. So that's now paragraph 4. So it says agreement commences when signed and subject to the compensation paragraph termination at 11:59 on whatever, or upon ratification of a lease for premises, whichever is earlier. Agreement automatically terminates 90 days after agreement. And of course, that would be if you don't fill in that term date, right? So if you leave that blank. So they added in some verbiage there to say that that the agreement terminates upon the ratification of a lease, right? Because why did they add that in there, right? Because we're always getting called by our landlord after the fact, right? With questions or problems or issues or whatever, right? So in reality, we are out of an agreement with them at that time. So remember, when you're getting asked those questions, right, there's no brokerage agreement in place for you and Sampson protection in regards to providing advice or things to direction for that landlord. So I always say a landlord serious about renting property should always have an attorney that they rely on for those type of questions. Because you never need an attorney until you need one, right? They also broadened the options for broker compensation. Now, if you remember in the previous edition, right, they had the two fields, right? One was how much you were charging for that tenant for your representation, and then underneath that, it had another paragraph that said that you were going to seek compensation from the landlord in the amount of whatever that amount was now, right? So that's not there anymore. They combined everything into one. So now they have the tenant broker compensation, same format as all the other forms, 3 different ways you can highlight that fee. And then what they did was they said tenant enters into a lease for any real property during the term of the agreement. Tenant is responsible for payment of broker compensation at ratification of the lease. If broker receives any compensation from the landlord or landlord's representative for services covered by agreement, that amount will be credited towards the tenant's obligation to pay brokerage compensation. A lot more simple, a lot more easily to read, a lot more easily to discuss with your client as well. The other way was very confusing. Do I fill out the top part? Do I fill out the bottom part? Do I fill out both parts? So I'm glad they made this change. And of course, on this one, they say if you have a current tenant agreement in place, you don't have to update it just because of this change. Questions on this one?
Which one? Sorry. No added language on this about collecting more? No added language on this about collecting higher, because I think Sotheby's is a mandated 40%. So get those Sotheby's rentals if you're working with tenants. So they'll offer 40.
Right.
So if your agreement says 25,
You could add other
there's no
provisions in
language.
there as well.
So
But
there's
no
language.
language in here that says that the brokerage can't receive excessive amount. And then the release of brokerage representation agreement. This form was updated to include options for the parties to agree on whether the broker's compensation obligations are released and to keep or renegotiate the early termination fee. So on your release of brokerage representation agreement, so this could be used on any of your forms for representation, right? If you're departing ways with your particular client, paragraph 4 says that pursuant to the code, by the way of this release, the parties mutually agree to terminate this brokerage relationship and release the parties from any terms, conditions, duties, and responsibilities set forth by the brokerage agreement and by law. Exclusive of any obligations, amendments, or provisions outlined herein, the release does or does not release the seller, landlord, or buyer-tenant brokerage compensation payment obligations under this brokerage representation agreement. And then paragraph 5, if applicable, seller, landlord, or buyer-tenant will pay an early termination fee as follows, and that's as outlined in the brokerage agreement, or which supersedes any amount that may have been outlined in the brokerage agreement. So say in your brokerage agreement you had a higher amount and you mutually agreed to release for a lower amount, you would fill that bottom part out. So this would be was updated, which you should be using when you terminate. Don't use the brokerage representation agreement. The brokerage representation agreement amendment, because this one has the actual language for the termination and severs that relationship. Questions? Man, that's good. You guys are awesome. All right. Next on the docket here is the appraisal contingency. I didn't add that in here, but it's just for no finance contingency for appraisal contingency. So it removes or voids from options A or B if there is no automatic right to void. So just a new thing on that form. I didn't add it in here, so yeah, it's not in there. Paragraphs next 7, VRLTA lease. This form was updated a bunch of ways. If you do a lot of leases, pay attention. So the VRLTA lease was updated. Paragraph 1 includes definition of rent from VRLTA and clarifies how it is payable. So they updated this paragraph to quantify what rent is, right? If we didn't know what rent is, now we do, right? Because now it tells us. It means all money other than the security deposit owed or paid to the landlord under lease, including prepaid rent paid more than 1 month in advance, or the rent due date. No fee shall be collected unless it is listed below or incorporated into the agreement by way of a separate addendum after execution of this rental agreement. For the purpose of this lease, all payments, included but not limited to rent and security deposit, will be payable in certified funds, electronic funds, transfer, cashier's check, money order, or bank wired funds as the parties may agree, right? And you can alter that as well, of course, as the listing agent, whatever way you want that money, or the landlord wants that money to be received. Sir.
So that does not mean personal check, right? The way it's written. And it does not mean ACH. I mean, our accounting office, to the best of my knowledge, they don't even take ACHs. They don't want to take ACHs as opposed to a bank wire. They'll definitely take a bank wire. And yes, we have been in practice taking Zocam images of personal checks. We don't have a company policy that says no personal checks, but that lease pretty much prohibits it. It says cashier's check, right? Or money order, bank wired funds, but not ACH, okay? And the reason is somebody can pull back an ACH easier, and it takes longer for it to clear, and the personal checks. So if you're going to take a personal check or Zocam on a personal check, don't do it at the last minute if your people are expecting occupancy in the next several days. Because if that check doesn't clear, then you're not going to have much time. So.
Right, and this also sets up the payments for the landlord to pay the tenant, right? So Mike's talking about the first month's rent that comes to us, right, the way we can take it. But this is also setting up that the landlord wants to receive the rent in these ways, right? Certified funds, electronic fund transfer, which could be Venmo. I mean, it could be any type of, it could be ACH for that. Yeah. But this is setting up between the landlord and the tenant as well. So
my bad.
But that's okay. Yes.
Do you recommend if you're representing the tenant, do you recommend telling your tenant to bring the check themselves or to get it from them and then bring it to the broker?
I always recommend that we control it. I mean, we have a lot of folks that will give the client access or information to deposit through Zocam, which I think is a bad move because it always ends up in the wrong account. I would always recommend, if you're working with a tenant, if you're trying to deposit that with Samson and you're going to deposit it via Zocam, then I would collect that check and then make the deposit myself, right? If they're closer to Chantilly, they can always drop it off. I would try and refrain as well from dropping it at an outlying location and leaving it in a basket to get to Samson somewhere along the line. Not that I don't trust the couriers that are moving the mail around, but I mean, if you're trying to represent a tenant and that money is crucial to getting things moving forward, do you want to leave it in the hands of couriers moving it around and getting it to the right spot? I mean, yeah, sometimes we'll find if there's a check missing, we'll find it, but it may not be right away, right? Somehow it got put in this box instead of that box, or got put in your personal mailbox, right? They dropped it at the Woodbridge location and they put your name on it. And then it ends up here and they put it in your mailbox here or whatever. So just be careful when you're shuttling those checks around, right?
Steve, and if they if the instruction is for them to bring it to Chantilly headquarters accounting, which is where all money needs to come, and that's great, whether it's mailed or dropped off, they need to be reminded to make it attention accounting, not addressed solely to you as the listing agent, okay? Because our front desk doesn't open mail that's addressed to you. They put it in your mailbox here. So it could sit for a number of days over there unless it was clearly addressed to accounting, and always have a memo, of course, as to what it's for.
So are we saying that we should not take Zoocam pictures of personal checks in this instance?
I didn't mean to give that impression.
No.
My point is that when you're doing Zocam, I mean, it's the same thing for EMD for a purchase, right? If it's a personal check, you got to make sure you got enough time between closing on a buy or occupancy, certainly getting the keys on a lease for the check to clear if it's a personal check. Whether you deposit it via Zocam or it's brought here, it's still going to be. Zocam is not magically some faster process of clearing of the check. It's just electronic deposit, but it's still a personal check. That's all. And my point was that that language in the lease is in keeping what has always been the case. The listing brokerage and the landlord have the right to insist that it be cashier's check, money order, or bank wire. Sometimes property management companies and landlords require that of the security deposit as well, especially if you're going to get the security deposit right before occupancy, because that happens a lot, right? First month's rent comes in earlier,
Right.
As soon as the lease is signed or whatever, but a lot of times security deposit isn't paid to the landlord until just days before move-in, and you certainly wouldn't want a personal check then for that.
Right. My rule of thumb is I normally say if they ask if they can pay by personal check and it's 15 days or less that they're moving into the property, I say no, it has to be certified funds. If it's over 15 days, I will normally allow a personal check because we have plenty of time to make sure that money has cleared prior to them occupying the property.
So either way, whether it's a picture in Zoocam or not, you still have to deliver the hard check.
No, if you have a check in hand as an agent and you upload it into Zocam, you don't have to bring that check in. So it's uploaded, it's deposited directly, and you just keep that check. I would take that check and I would write void across the top of it and put it in your file with the rest of your stuff.
But Steve's point was partly the preference is for you as the listing agent to get that check in your hand, and then you can do Zocam yourself because you're more familiar with it, rather than having the tenant download the app and
Right.
fumble through
Try
it.
and pick which Sampson office to drop it to deposit it to make sure that it's just an easier feat for you because you're hopefully used to the app than a tenant trying to navigate it for the first time.
Okay.
And these tenants are typically motivated enough that if they're not, it would be very rare that they would be, I don't have time to bring it to you. They can bring it to you, even though you're the listing agent. Even if they have a tenant, if they have their own tenant agent, either the tenant themselves or the tenant agent could bring you that physical check.
Okay.
Next to you. CC.
Now you're talking about security deposit. I usually have them bring the security deposit at the time of lease signing, if possible. If 2 months, then they want to split, that make a difference, but I always collect money up front when they're signing lease.
Well, having been a property manager for many years, right? the general practice for people that aren't property manager is we collect the first month's rent check first, and then we pay everybody, right? And then the check that's collected at the time of moving, theoretically, is the security deposit, right? Well, in property management, the first check you receive is a security deposit. It gets held as a security deposit. And then when they move in, whatever that date is, that's the first month's rent. So I think we've done it this way for a lot of years because we want to get paid, right? We want to get paid. So the first check that comes in, we get it made out to Sampson, and that becomes our commission. I don't like doing it that way, and I still don't do it, even though I haven't been doing property management for over a year now, because I can't count the number of times I've either answered the phone or had this happen where you disperse that commission and then the tenant calls up or something happens and they're trying to dissolve the deal. And now you have to try and figure out ways to get that commission back if possible in order to reimburse that tenant. So I'm just saying scenario, you sign a lease. A couple days after, or a week later, you find out the tenant isn't getting transferred here anymore. Their orders got changed, whether they're military, government, or whatever. Their orders got changed, and now they're going to wherever. So they need to get out of the lease, right? Yes, you can negotiate. Yes, you can try and negotiate part of that security deposit or first month's rent, but the landlord's the one standing there. They're the ones with the loss because now they don't have a tenant, and we've got paid, right? So they're always looking to us for that money, right? They want that money back, right, for their loss if there isn't incurring a loss. Or maybe the landlord agrees, hey, we'll give them back their money and we'll just put it back on the market. It'll rent pretty quick. We had 17 applications, whatever. So I've just found that in order to avoid that, I collect the security deposit up front, and then when they move in, I collect the first month's rent, and then I pay everybody, right? Seems to work better for me, but
That's under That's under property management,
right.
because we don't want.
Well,
a
you can
check,
do it that way as a tenant,
but
You
we
can
don't
do
want
that.
a check that's labeled security deposit,
Right.
deposited into Sampson Properties, because we're not the escrow agent. I mean, we're not. We collect, and the new document expressly allows us to collect the first month's rent, right?
Right now, yes.
Not security deposit.
Right. Yeah, in the old document, there was no language like this, right? And all it said in there was that the first month's rent would be paid in certified funds. And then we're asking for them theoretically for the security deposit when they first sign the lease, but in reality that we're changing that and turning it into the first month's rent. Mm-hmm. Well, now with this is kind of clarification. Yes, we take the first month's rent now and we can, move on that way. But I don't know, I haven't gotten into the next paragraph where it actually talks about how that money is supposed to be paid.
But to Cece's point, she speaks as a landlord too, right? I mean,
Right.
Number of rental properties, but in the old days, it was not uncommon at all for the listing agent and landlord or property manager to require certified funds, both first month's rent and security deposit together up front. It is, over time, it has become less common, and you'll get some pushback on that sometimes if you're a listing agent from tenant rep agents where they're like, what? Because it's not as common as it used to be in our market for the tenant to have to put up that much money, certified funds, certainly before they have a signed lease. And I would be a little reluctant to do so if I was a tenant, unless we're meeting together and signing, and here's the money, give me a copy of my lease,
Right. And I normally, and another practice I developed in property management as well was I don't provide a signed copy of the lease back until I get whatever funds are required at the time of lease signing. So the landlord, say the landlord will review the lease, they won't sign it. I'll send it to the tenant will review it and sign it. I give them a deadline. Once they send it back, I get it back signed from them. I say, hey, I'm sending this over to the landlord for review and signature. Here's what I need. And I need that prior to me giving you an executed lease back. And I haven't had any problem collecting the money prior to sending them that lease.
And along those lines, I would not send the tenant a landlord signed lease. Make them sign first.
Yeah. Best practice for sure. Good point, Mr. Briggs. You the man. So also in this paragraph, it says included all potential fees in the first paragraph in accordance with the VRLTA. So that language was added in there. Paragraph 2, premise. So paragraph 2 now includes definition of what premise is from the VRLTA. Clarifies what is included in the grounds, right? Landlord leases the tenant, and the tenant leases from the landlord the dwelling unit and the structure of which is part facility and appendices contained thereof, and grounds, area, and facility held out for the use of the tenant generally, or those used in the premise to the landlord, and it addresses those things. So you will have an occasion on where a tenant or a landlord may have stuff like maybe they decided they don't want to convey the garage, like it's a standalone garage or a standalone barn or a standalone shed, and they may have their own personal belongings in there because they're State Department, they're overseas somewhere, and they put their stuff in storage and whatever. Just make sure that you reference this somewhere in the lease that that area is not for use by the tenants. Paragraph 6 expands the manner in which rent is payable to the landlord. So under this 6, if you had a management company, you would fill out the top part. If the premises are not professionally managed, all references to managing agent are hereby deleted in their entirety, and the rent is payable to the landlord in the following manner. So however that rent is going to be paid, if it's going directly to the landlord, their information, address, whatever, phone number, email address. Paragraph 10 reduces the number of occupants to 6. So I believe it used to be 8 or 10. Now they reduced it to 6. So paragraph 12, clarify entire utilities and services paragraph. Specify what tenant is responsible for paying, tenant paid versus what is included in the landlord's rent. So they kind of reworked this paragraph a little bit. I mean, I thought the other paragraph was fine. They had little check boxes, but evidently it didn't work very well. So now they have the tenant paid, and then they have landlord paid. So whatever may be included in the rent, you may have a condo that includes all utilities, so that would all be under tenant paid. Or if you have a single family home and everything has to be paid by the tenant, and maybe the landlord is paying, for trash, whatever, that would be on either side. And then I just thought this tip was kind of funny that they added in here for this. It says legal hotline questions of the month regarding lease renewals. So a lot of people, we're all calling in regarding lease renewal issues. Like, so if a client calls us and they want to renew the lease, so how that, what's the legal process? Remember, if you get a call from a tenant, they want to renew the lease, theoretically we need a brokerage agreement in place in order to renew that lease for that landlord, right? So we would do a brokerage agreement, same brokerage agreement we always use for listing a property, and then we would just denote in there that we're doing it for release renewal and whatever that fee is. All right, next on the docket is the solar panel addendum to the listing agreement. Becoming more and more popular, right? I'm seeing more and more houses with solar panels on the roofs. So this is the addendum right here. Did I have a page 2? Yay, yes. All right. So they changed. This is a big change, so pay attention. They changed solar panel manufacturer to installer. No laughs. You guys don't get my sense of humor. Man, you guys have been with me long enough. Come on. So that was a big change, right? So now it's listed as the installer, not necessarily the manufacturer. Clarify that if the solar panel is subject to more than one solar loan, the parties must execute separate addenda for each loan. So those are the two highlighted areas here. In paragraph 1, the solar energy collection device, solar panel, has been installed on the property. Solar panel installer is whomever, and the contract account number is whatever. So you'd have to get that information. And then at the end of paragraph B, they added, if solar panel is subject to more than one solar loan, parties must execute separate solar panel addenda in listing agreement. So just keep those two things in mind if they have more than one loan on a solar panel. Hopefully not, right? If those solar panels are so expensive that they require 2 loans, they may want to opt to stick with electricity, right? Or that's a really big house. Holy Toledo. All right, the addendum is the solar panel contingency addendum to the sales contract, right? So if you're writing an offer on a property that has solar panels, this would be the addendum that you would use. So it's set up similar to all the other addendums that we normally use. The first change that they made to this addendum was they changed from manufacturer to installer as well on this form, and that they clarified that if the solar panel is subject to more than one solar loan, the parties must execute separate contingencies for each one. So you would use this form for one loan and another one contingency for another loan, right? So you would need 2 of these for your contract. Maybe next change they'll have this all incorporated into one, or maybe, I don't know. So, so what they did was they have the solar loan. If solar panel is subject to more than one solar loan, parties must execute separate solar panel contingency addendums to the sale contract. And here it gives you all the information that you would need in order for that one loan. So if they have another loan, you would need to fill out another one for that loan. They also clarify that if the buyer fails to assume the solar loan, contract is automatically void. Unless parties agree otherwise in writing, this protects both parties. So hopefully so what they did here in this solar panel financing contingency, right? Before, if the buyer didn't if the contingency didn't allow for the buyer or the seller to void the contract, that the buyer couldn't get the loan, right, through the solar company or the installer. So now the solar loan financing deadline is whatever, you fill that in. If after diligent and good faith effort, buyer fails to obtain approval from the solar company and loan servicer for solar loan financing deadline, contract is void unless otherwise agreed to by the parties in writing. So it allows the contract to be void because they don't qualify for that loan or both those loans. All right, moving on. So this is a new form, right? This one, I think we had one that we made that was in the Sampson folder for requesting tenant broker compensation agreement. Now NVAR has come out with theoretically that same form on its own. And that form is here for you. It's going to be uploaded in the NVAR library. So anytime you're writing an offer or having your clients put in an application on a property, once you understand or confirm what the tenant rep compensation may be, you would fill out this form and send it over for signatures by all parties. I would say probably once their application has been approved, before or somewhere between there and lease signing or somewhere in that general neighborhood would probably be a good rule of thumb as to when to get this form signed. You had a question? You made a statement?
So rent spree doesn't speak to tenant broker compensation.
Doesn't.
Right? No. Even though rent spree part of, is it tied into Bright MLS, Steve?
Well, they have
An affiliation?
they have I don't want to say affiliation, but they have a contract with Rent Spree, so you can tag it to your listing when you put your listing in for rent, and they charge a fee. Sampson also has it as well, where you can do the same thing through SkySlope, but I don't think there's an affiliation.
My point is, it would be nice. It would be nice. I mean, we don't have it. It's gone from MLS, but it'd be nice if it could be clear in the rental application process whether there's compensation or not. Because if you're a tenant rep, my point is, when are you going to send that document? Before you show the property? I mean, the options there are, it's being agreed that the listing brokerage is making a commitment to Sampson Properties to payment for that compensation, or it's going to be part of the lease effectively, where the landlord is taking direct responsibility, just like they do with the new residential sales contract, where the seller is agreeing in the contract to pay us. That's the second option in there, right?
Right. It's already outlined in their listing agreement what they have agreed to pay for tenant rep, right?
But as a tenant rep agent, what do you recommend, Steve, for securing confirmation that you're going to get paid before you show property?
I don't normally call. I'll show a property or show properties, and then once my client wants to make application, I'll call the agent and I'll say, hey, I have someone that wants to make application. We're going to apply through RentSpree. I'll talk to them briefly about it, and then I'll say, hey, are you guys offering tenant rep compensation? Yes, we are. How much are you offering? 25%, $500, whatever that amount is. I say, okay. A lot of times I'll send an email afterwards, and I'll say, hey, my clients have filled out the application. You should see it in RentSpree. And as per our conversation, you said you were paying out 25% of 1 month's rent to the tenant rep. Thank you, blah, 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 blah. I'll be sending over a form after, if and when application is approved for solidifying compensation. And then after we get approval, I'll send over the form. I normally do it before the lease is even generated. I send it out as soon as we get notified that they've been approved. I'll send that form out and ask for whatever it is. If it's a Sampson listing, like I just say, hey, I have a brokerage agreement for 25%. You don't have to send that form. Trust me. And I haven't had any problems. All right, so continuing on with this form, like I said, it's a new form. So this form is designed to be flexible and for use by either side prior to the lease ratification. For example, the tenant agent could present it to the listing agent or the landlord prior to the tenant's submission of the rental application, or the listing agent could present it to the tenant and their agent when they come to tour the property. So, there's no set time when you want to do this. Me personally, some people have called and said, hey, Steve, should I send this form every time I'm going to show a property? That would be crazy, right? It depends on how many properties you're going to show. I wouldn't want this. I wouldn't want an agent calling me if I had a listing for rent and they all kept calling me to sign these agreements. How many agreements do we have out there to pay X amount of percent, right? So once you have accepted one, in my opinion, because some agents wouldn't show the property until they had this thing signed, right? So this form is not an addendum to the lease. It's a separate agreement. This form is not needed if there is no tenant broker compensation. So if you call and they say we're not paying anything, you don't need this form. So your tenant would be on the hook to pay whatever is in that agreement. So how to use this form? Top identifies the tenant brokerage. This form only applies when the tenant is represented. The next paragraph 1 identifies who, if anyone, will be paying TBC, either the listing brokerage or the landlord. The chosen payor will be a party to the agreement along with the payee. Paragraph 2 is clear. Ascertainable numbers identified to the amount that the parties selected in paragraph 1 will be paying to the brokerage compensation, and then there's a signature line that would be signed by all parties. So just kind of reviewing this agreement real quick. As you see on there, it has the listing brokerage or the landlord for the parties, and then whatever that compensation could be, and that could be a percentage or a flat fee. If you've done any rentals, you've probably already seen this form because we have like a rendition of it under a Sampson header that I think Mike created.
Yeah, NVAR came out with the fundamental language in August. They didn't come out with the new form till now, but in August they had recommended language on their website, and they said just cut and paste this, use it. So we did. We created our own form, and it's in SkySlope. It'll be replaced by these. by this document. And
Yes.
you know, I think just maybe it's a no-brainer, but at the very latest, if I'm a tenant rep agent, I'm going to predicate, the lease ratification on having that be part of it, right? I mean, so before your tenant signs off on, you should try to hopefully get it in advance if the listing agent's working with you. But when you have your tenant sign the lease, make sure that it's sent back with this if you haven't already gotten it, and say, this is a condition of lease ratification, right? That's the last point in time when you'd want to have this executed.
And then I just wanted to read this last practice tip that was here on the last page of this document that NVAR sent out. It says, keep in mind NAR Code of Ethics, Article 16-16, which states realtors acting as subagents or buyer-tenant representatives or brokers shall not use the terms of an offer to purchase or lease to attempt to modify the listing broker's offer of compensation to subagents or buyer-tenant representatives or broker, nor make the submission of an executed offer to purchase or lease contingent on the listing brokerage agreement to modify their offer of compensation. So take that into account as well, right? So if they're offering, if I have a brokerage agreement for 25, say on this, 25%, you showed the property, now you're coming after me for a higher number, theoretically it could be a code of ethics violation, right? 16, right? So before you show the property, if you call and say, hey, how much are you paying? And I tell you nothing, or, and you come back and say, well, I want to show it. I have tenants that are government employees, 800 credit scores. I want to show them, but I have a brokerage agreement with them for X amount of dollars. Are you willing to pay that? Yes or no? No. Okay, we're going to go look somewhere else, or, whatever. But don't do it after you show it, because now it can be considered trying to alter their terms of their listing agreement. All right. Thank you for coming.